Welcome to Transparency in the Software Supply Chain, making SBOM a reality. You're here with Dr. Alan Friedman. He joins us from the US Department of Commerce. That's pretty impressive. A few reminders before we begin. Please stop by the business hall located in Mandalay Bay. There is a welcome reception at 5:30, just after this talk tonight. The Black Hat Arsenal, it's going to be in the Black Hat Hall in this level as well. The Pawnee Awards is going to be in Lagoon JKL tonight at 6:30 p.m. So please put your phone in silence. We appreciate that. And again, please give a warm welcome to our speaker today, Dr. Alan Friedman. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelo. Thank you all for coming out for the last session today. Really appreciate it. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alan. I'm known as the guy from the government with the strange hair. I used to be a computer scientist. I wasn't a very good one. So I got my PhD in public policy, which means that I'm also a mediocre economist and a mediocre computational modeler. When you're mediocre at that many different things, you tend to end up in Washington, D.C. So I've been working for the Department of Commerce at NTIA for about 4.5 years, and we're really excited about this initiative because it's not us. We sort of catalyzed it, but the work is coming from the community. Some of you I see here today. So first, basic question. Who knows this logo? Someone shout it out. VxWorks. Raise your hand if you have VxWorks on your network somewhere. Everyone in the room should have raised their hand. This stuff is in everything. There were 11 vulnerabilities that were announced last week. It is absolutely insane that we have an ecosystem where we can't tell whether we have something that might put us at risk and where it is. And so that's what this is about. Now, the problem with being the last talk of the day is not only do I have to be more interesting than your phone, I have to be more interesting than beer. So we're gonna try. I'm gonna first revisit some of the motivations, why this is important, and say, why aren't we already doing this? I'm gonna talk to you about some of the progress that we've made so far as a community and what comes next, because my goal at the end of this talk is to help you appreciate, one, that this is coming, and two, it will be much better if all of you come and join us and make it a reality sooner. So, some analogy. You can't go to the candy store and buy a piece of candy without it coming with a list of ingredients. Most of the time, you don't care, right? Candy is delicious. Unless there's someone in your life that has a food allergy or sensitivity. And then it's really important that that information is available in an accessible format. And it's not just the consumer space. This is how business works. If you have a factory, you get a pallet load of chemicals. Each barrel comes with what's called a safety data sheet. It's an ISO standard that says, hey, what happens if this spills and washes over everyone's toes? We have that information available so that we can do business. And in fact, the term, a bill of materials, comes straight out of industry. We've been using this concept for 80 years or more. If you buy a 10-ton diesel generator today, it will come with a bill of materials, a list of every nut and every bolt. Why? So that you can do maintenance, you can do operation. You know what you're putting in your business. I also want to point out that if you buy that 10-ton generator today, it's probably going to be connected to the internet. And you have no idea what's in that software stack on a piece of something that's very important for your infrastructure. So, why aren't we doing this for software today? Well, first, we need to appreciate how the software industry and the ecosystem is a little different, right? It comes in a supply chain that is quite long and complex. It starts with small pieces of software. Anyone remember LeftPad? And then it slowly gets combined and recombined until smaller components become bigger components, which become products, which then get folded into other products. We're talking about the entire ecosystem here. It goes from open source, it includes DevSecOps, it includes the people who are making things and the people who are running them. In order to understand it, we need to think about those perspectives. I'll try to boil it down to 3 different perspectives on the supply chain. Many of us produce software. Some of us buy software, most of us operate software. And it turns out that there's some benefits for transparency for each of those perspectives. So if you produce software, first and foremost, Are there vulnerabilities that you're shipping out the door? But it's about more than that. It can help with cost. It can help with bloat. It can help think about license obligations. You can communicate your good software practices downstream to your consumer. If you buy software, again, first and foremost, is what I'm about to put on my network vulnerable? I can begin to have more targeted analysis. Okay, it's got this component. Do I care about it? Hey, is this particular component going to be end of life soon? How do I think about this as part of my broader risk package? And then, of course, there are the folks with the beepers who are maintaining your software, who are running it day by day. For me, this started with the fundamental question, am I affected by new vulnerabilities? How do we make sure that that information is available? How do we have real-time data about that? And by the way, if there is a potential vulnerability, while you're waiting for the vendor or the open source community, if you know about it, then you can take other mitigations. You can protect yourself better. So why aren't we doing this today? Here's one reason, right? Licensing is incredibly fraught. And most of us who spend our days in software and security really don't like to think about it. So we just use a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Until a couple of years ago, I don't know how many of the largest tech companies in the world could honestly say that they weren't shipping GPL'd code. But there's good news. I would argue that that is a much better understood risk today, right? Every corporate risk officer thinks about it. If you're in a startup, you're not going to think about exit until you've done a license audit. And there are lots of great tools that can help you with it today. Go to the floor and buy some. The other problem is it's hard. I've talked to some of the biggest tech companies in the world that are still struggling with this question of how do we put this on a single pane of glass? How do we actually look at all of our different product families so we can have a shared vision? Part of the challenge is naming. What's this product? Apache Web Server. Apache Web Server. 10 of the biggest tech companies in the world did some internal dating. Turns out 5 different names for their internal systems. It's not great if you're trying to actually track it and get a computer to do the work for you. Naming is a known hard problem. We've solved it exactly once in the entire history of the internet. It's called DNS. Costs a couple tens of millions of dollars to run a year. But I think fundamentally, the real reason we're not doing it today is that no one's asking for it. And because no one's asking for it, no one's providing it. Now that, to my mediocre economist ears, sounds like a market failure. And to my government ears, that sounds like a job for the government. So, how do we usually solve problems in the government? Well, we can beat you into submission, or we can bribe you into doing the right thing. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how well you know me, Congress didn't bother to give me any legal authority to do anything, really. So I can't really get anyone to do something. But they also, no one gave me a budget or a staff, so I can't bribe you into doing anything. So what we have at NTIA is called the multi-stakeholder model. Now, if you roll your eyes at hearing it, I'm the guy who has to say it like 10 times a day. But fundamentally, it's, I think, a genuinely powerful way of getting work done, which is you bring the right people in the room and you say, what will make this work? How do we all come together? The analogy I like is we got a bunch of people that all want to get in the pool. No one wants to be the first one in the pool. We can run around and shove children. We can promise them ice cream. Or we can all hold hands and count to 10 and get things done. So I want to be very clear what we're not doing. This is the obligatory CYA slide. This is not about regulation. NTIA is not a regulator. Sometimes we fight regulators. Sometimes we work nicely with them. But in general, not what we want. It is not source code disclosure. The Department of Commerce is strongly against mandatory source code disclosure. And of course, it's not standards development. If you want to go with standards, you go talk to my friends at the Department of Commerce at NIST. They're just up the road from me. They have a lot more money. They do amazing work. Go talk to them. What are we trying to solve here? So first thing stakeholders did was they drafted a problem statement. The wall of text basically says, supply chains are complex. We need to have composition awareness, thinking about risk, and also cost. Everything we're talking about today ideally should translate to dollars and cents. The overall goal is to harmonize the existing efforts. Some of this is happening already today in different pieces and parts. We want to amplify what works and make it a routine, make it more common, make it accessible. We want to be able to extend what works and ideally foster innovation so that next year or the year after, some of you guys have startups to help companies deal with this data and generate this data. In the past year since we've started this, I announced this program last year at Black Hat, we've made some real progress. There's broad consensus on the scope of the problem, the need to say, let's solve part of it first, let's crawl, walk, run, and let's focus on automation. We have 4 working groups. They're not quite finished. September 5th is when they're gonna have some documents that are gonna be ready for full-on public review. Basically think of this as the what, the why, the how, and the screw it, we're gonna do it live. So, what is an SBOM? Turns out, even though a lot of us came to the table with some good ideas, once you actually try to be precise about what it is and what it isn't, it takes a little work. Who knew? Engineering's hard. At its core, it's about a component of software. What is a component? Well, it's a thing that you got from someplace else that has a name. So, how do we think about names? Well, there are a number of parts of a name. I already mentioned that naming is hard. We have the term sufficiently uniquely identify the components. So ideally, supplier component version. A hash would be lovely. It has the benefit of helping people know that, by the way, this piece of software you got from an approved repo, you didn't go and download it from some random site that was using a cloned, backdoored version. Now, we have these components, and they're in relationships. What is the most important relationship we're talking about? X includes Y. There are other relationships that we can get into. We can talk about built on the standard, we can talk about compiled with, but we're gonna start with just the basic notion, includes. That means that the software is there, so it's potentially putting you at risk. One of the real questions is how far down in the graph do we go? Ideally, I would love to go all the way down. Someone once said to me, I wanna know everything that's in my product all the way down to the sand. Lovely goal, I don't think we're gonna get there yet. I think the compromise approach, if we're trying to promote more rapid adoption, is to have a recursive approach, which is to say, my obligation is twofold. One, I have to report my top line includes. What am I using? I pass those down to my customers, further down the supply chain, and I also go upstream a hop and ask my suppliers, what are their top line includes? So that helps us have this sort of more supply chain expressive approach. Not everything is going to be available, which means we need to be able to be clear about opacity. Hey, I'm using this component, it has all these great pieces, and I'm also using this component. I have no idea what's under the hood there. Okay, that's a good start. That helps the person who's using your software begin to make a risk decision. Do they care about what's in that component or not? So, that's the basics of what. Why should we do this? Well, I've already talked about some of the benefits. This working group looked at a bunch of different use cases and really boiled it down to these 3 perspectives and some benefits that can be conferred. And again, not all of those are about security. A lot of those are about efficiency. And by the way, security can be about efficiency. If you can reduce your mean time to remediation, you've saved your company a lot of money. But that data was actually built on some interviews with real people. If anyone says that they can't do it, we've got some evidence that people who are doing this today, maybe not completely, but a lot of people are thinking about this. But the benefit to all of us comes when a lot more of us work on this. Great. So we got the what, we've got the why. So, hey, how do we do it? I've got 10 minutes left. We're not gonna put too much code up there. What I wanna remind you is, 1, we're not a standards development process. The good news is there is at least one standard out there that will do this. because at its core, again, it's about describing components and their relationships. The bad news is that there are two standards out there that do this. So, always good to have one. We've got two. One of them comes from Linux Foundation. It's called the Software Package Data Exchange. It's, again, built around licensing, wasn't built to SBOM, can be used to SBOM. It's extensible, it's open source, so it's a continuing evolving project. The second one is called SWID, Software ID Tags. Again, built for licensing purposes, meant to track software on disk. It's an ISO standard. That's great, unless you're one of those people who thinks that you shouldn't pay 970 Swiss francs for a document. But there's good news there too, because there's a lot of information, including some published by my aforementioned friends at NIST, that describe exactly what a SWID tag is. It's XML, and what we've focused on is making sure that we can work with both of them. We're gonna be Canada, right? We're gonna be a bilingual society. It's not the government's job to pick winners and losers. We're aware that in different regions, people are gonna use one or the other. But at the end of the day, you should be able to take software component data from one format and put it into the format of your choice. So that's really the goal. So we've got the what, the why, and the how. Then there's the screw it, we're gonna do it live. At our first meeting, there were some people who showed up to push back and said, hey, we don't think this is possible. And some folks in the medical device community said, no, not only is this possible, but we need this. Now, part of the reason they needed it is because their regulator told them that they kind of had to do it. But their regulator, the FDA, and they're wonderful, by the way. They are probably my favorite regulators when it comes to cybersecurity in the entire US government. Suzanne Schwartz and her team are wonderful. But what they did is they pointed the entire sector to this NTIA process and say, hey, this shouldn't be a sector-specific solution. This should work with everyone. So, some of the biggest medical device manufacturers in the world, Siemens, Abbott, Philips, these are big companies that you've already heard of, said, we're gonna work with some of the best hospitals in America, Mayo, Cleveland Clinic, not Cleveland Clinic, and so they basically said, let's do this. Now, the good news is that they were able to do this. They were able to generate data from medical device manufacturers, send it to the hospitals, who were able to use that data to successfully complete predefined use cases around security, around asset management, around pre-purchase risk-based decision-making. The bad news is that they weren't able to do it completely automatically. And that's okay, because we're gonna make progress. But this was their first attempt to just say, we're gonna try to do this without any grand strategy, and they were able to get most of the way there. So it's our job to carry the ball and move forward. There's still some open questions. One of the big ones is, what are the obstacles to finding this data? In some ecosystems, it's gonna be pretty easy to identify what your components are. If your development world has the word package manager in it, you're probably gonna be okay. That stuff's there. In other areas where the software is a lot more diffuse from many more different communities, then solving these issues of making sure that there's enough metadata to produce the data that's valuable to ship downstream, it's gonna be a little bit of a challenge. We need to better understand and map that problem space. What does the act of transparency look like? So we're generating the data, we're using the data, how do we connect the two? Well, some cases it's pretty straightforward. A SWID tag is a metadata that actually follows the binary. So whenever your code changes, your SBOM changes, pretty easy. Probably doesn't work that well for an embedded device, especially one that you don't want a whole bunch of scanning tools running on that network. So we need to find some further solutions. I'm not personally wild about sort of having little domains of centralization, but I've heard from a couple of sectors. They're like, oh yeah, actually, we can imagine that we can have a trusted party hold this data for us so we can manage it for our sector. That's gonna be something that we're gonna have to sort out together. Perhaps one of the biggest challenges is this question of vulnerability versus exploitability. Depending on how you measure it, there are between 600 and 1,000 function calls you can make in OpenSSL version old.old. 2 of them are heart bleedable, right? It's a big ass library. So how do you communicate downstream that yes, we know this is going to set off a dashboard tool, but this is a very low priority? This is going to actually, because we're going to have a whole bunch of people more aware of risk, especially in the short run, we're going to have to learn how to prioritize. And that's going to require effort on both parts. This is about enabling a discussion of risk. What are the next steps? We're having a meeting in Washington, D.C. on September 5th. The working groups have been informed, with my absolutely zero authority, that they need to have some drafts ready by then. Again, the what, the why, the how, and the review of how people just tried to do it on a whim and what their lessons learned were. The next steps are really where it starts to gain traction, because this was just the base layer. To make progress, we need to think about how do we extend this model to capture more use cases, especially for higher assurance areas, telecom, national security, more critically regulated spaces. How do we make sure that there are tools that allow all of us to do this as we need to? So that's going to be collecting the ones from open source and starting to talk to commercial vendors to say, what could you do with this data? How could you help your customers if this data was available? And perhaps the most important approach you're already doing, which is you're listening and you're going to tell more people about this. This isn't an American initiative. This is a global initiative. We're working with the English, we're working with the Dutch, we're working with the Japanese. This isn't a sector-specific initiative. There are going to be certain sectors that can take the lead, and that's okay. But I would argue that all of us need this transparency. Supply chain risk is one of those magic words that everyone's talking about. There's no perfect solution. It's going to require a lot of work, some of it from the government, most of it from you. But I would argue that transparency is the base layer that almost all of those solutions are going to build on. So I'm hoping that you can help us. Thank you. I've been asked to remind you that if you would like to yell at me and use insults, please use the mics in the aisles. I would also remind you that there's beer if you just want to chat elsewhere. Here's how to get in touch with me. I will say that I am more than happy if you or your team are interested. After DEF CON, we will schedule a call. I will brief your entire team. This is my job. I want to hear feedback from you, and I want to catch you up to speed so that you can get involved. Yes?
I just got a quick question. I'm wondering what your thoughts have been thus far on how some of this plays through to cloud. Because when I look at the SWID tags format and some of those existing formats, and I try to figure out how I would put a Lambda function in there, I'm just wondering what your thoughts have been. It seems like some of the things that we're doing with cloud may need to be rethought with this.
I agree completely. So there are a couple of approaches. One is, if you're just doing ordinary AppSec, there's a huge value in this, right? Being able to track what components you're using enables whitelists, blacklists, all that lovely stuff. So really helpful on the dev side. On the risk side, I agree with you completely. I've started to have some discussions with the Cloud Security Alliance. If anyone else is interested, I actually just reached out to someone on Twitter who's been doing some work on cloud audit. Because on one hand, if we're talking about a risk discussion, well, for some of the SaaS stuff, when I'm using a big company, they're bearing all the risk. There's nothing they can tell me that would change my risk calculation beyond the initial vendor discussion. On the other end, let's imagine you bought a terrible outdated app. The whole thing just built on utter trash. So you WAF the thing 8 ways from Sunday. But the whole thing's built on struts. What is information that you need to tell me that would help me make a decision? We need to talk through not just the depth of the software, but the whole stack. And then finally, of course, there's containers. And then that is both important, but also a whole nother dimension.
So have you seen anything? You said there was maybe not so much a market need, but we've actually started to see it come up in procurement. and kind of approaching it from that perspective. And so we're actually asking folks, right, we're a national laboratory, so we're asking folks what is actually in this, right? So what is your kind of perspective on that? Are you seeing a lot of that? Or?
Completely. So I'll tell you 2 stories. One of the largest banks in America asks for this today. They don't care how you give it to them. You can fax it to them. And by the way, if you're doing it in PDF, you're doing it wrong. But they just want to know if you can generate this. Because in their experience, if you can't generate it, their costs of maintaining your software are expected to be much higher. So they will ask for 5 to 10% price reduction off the top. That's net. Imagine you're a sales engineer and you just find out that you get 10% less total on your contract just because the dev people can't keep track of what they're using. So that's one story where it's a dollars and cents approach. But I'll give you an example from the Mayo Clinic. They're also asking for this today. Doctors say, I need this fancy new piece of technology that's going to help me save lives. The security team today, they can't block the acquisition, but they can ask a lot of hard questions because they need to have a plan for when they put it on their network. And that's not a short conversation. How many people like their salespeople when they find out that their sales is going to be delayed 1 quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters, while they have that discussion? So we are slowly working on it today, and it's an evolutionary process because not everyone can develop this stuff today. I'd love to talk more about what you're doing. Sandia?
Yes, so earlier you mentioned that one of the dilemmas was how deep do you go in terms of detail? And then you're mentioning that you're going to try to set up a baseline, which sounds like it's kind of like a framework, right, for everybody. Have you done any sort of assessments or anything on, just how much value is going to be provided if you're stuck at a higher level of the architecture and that's it, you can't go any deeper? I mean, I'm not sure if you don't, have enough granularity, how valuable, this tool could be.
That is a huge question. I've had a lot of discussions with people about that, often with glasses in my hands. I haven't seen really good science because, again, every supply chain is a little different depending on what corner. I will say that for things like devices, operating system is so much more important than the things that are lower. So one thing that I'm starting to talk to are some of the people like Kenna, where they're looking what is actively being exploited, and that can start to give us some guidance. My suspicion is that as we go down, there's diminishing return, but I don't think it's a steep drop-off. I think it's more of a gradual drop-off. If there are any data science people here, would love to chat. I may have time for a super quick question.
Then I'll ask it. Why do you see FDA and subsequently med device as the first industry that's actually, spearheaded some progress here?
So this is a fun story of how do we explain public policy. And it's a couple of things. Agenda setting is a whole field of political science. More beer for that one. I think the real thing are twofold. One, there was a particularly active security researcher who was involved in a congressional task force. Josh Corman, some of you know him, was involved in a congressional task force that made a report to HHS, which is the government agency, the cabinet level agency that oversees FDA. So I said, hey, this would be a good idea. And then there was a particularly amazing, innovative policy person inside the FDA who said, how can we do this in a way that enhances patient safety and isn't overly burdensome on American businesses? And I think they looked at it and said, this gives us the right benefit with the minimal cost, and so they went forward for it. They already had the regulatory authority, and medical device manufacturers are already regulated, right? You can't put a device in a hospital without going through a bunch of tests first. So compared to some of the other sectors, it's going to be a much lower lift. Not trivial. I don't want to understate how much work is happening by some of the medical device manufacturers, but I think it's a great way to learn and for the rest of us to watch.
Cool, thank you.
All right, I think I am now out of time, which means you get to go and enjoy a fantastic night. I'll be sticking around at the after room, discussion room, whatever we're calling the Alan Loses His Voice room. More than happy to chat. If you're going off to have fun tonight, please take my email address and we'll follow up next week. Thank you again for your time.